by all yonder clash and clang, if there be no more than 500 men beyond the sand-hills, half of the Soldan's retinue must be drummers and cymbal-tossers? Shall I spur on?" The baron had checked his horse with the bit, and was just about to strike him with the spurs, when the King exclaimed, "Not for the world. Such a caution would express suspicion, and could do little to prevent surprise, which, however, I apprehended not." They advanced accordingly in close and firm order till they surmounted the line of low sandhills, and came in sight of the appointed station, when a splendid, but at the same time a startling spectacle awaited them. The diamond of the desert, so lately a solitary fountain, distinguished only amid the waste by solitary groups of palm trees, was now the centre of an encampment, the embroidered flags and gilded ornaments of which glittered far and wide, and reflected a thousand rich tints against the setting sun. The coverings of the large pavilions were of the gayest colours, scarlet, bright yellow, pale blue, and other gaudy and gleaming hues, and the tops of their pillars, or tent poles, were decorated with golden pomegranates and small silken flags. But besides these distinguished pavilions, there was what Thomas de Vaux considered as a portentous number of the ordinary black tents of the Arabs, being sufficient, as he conceived, to accommodate, according to the Eastern fashion, a host of 5,000 men. A number of Arabs and Kurds, fully corresponding to the extent of the encampment, were hastily assembling, each leading his horse in his hand, and their muster was accompanied by an astonishing clamour of their noisy instruments of martial music, by which, in all ages, the warfare of the Arabs has been animated. They soon formed a deep and confused mass of dismounted cavalry in front of their encampment, when, at the signal of a shrill cry, which rose high over the clangour of the music, each cavalier sprung to his saddle. A cloud of dust arising at the moment of this manoeuvre hid from Richard and his attendants the camp, the palm trees, and the distant ridge of mountains, as well as the troops whose sudden movement had raised the cloud, and, ascending high over the hills, formed itself into the fantastic forms of wreathed pillars, domes, and marionettes. Another shrill yell was heard from the bosom of this cloudy tabernacle. It was a signal for the cavalry to advance, which they did at full gallop, disposing themselves as they came forward so as to come in at once on the foot, flanks, and rear of Richard's little bodyguard, who were thus surrounded and almost choked by the dense clouds of dust enveloping them on each side, through which were seen alternately and lost the grim forms and wild faces of the Saracens, brandishing and tossing their lances in every possible direction, with the wildest cries and halloos, and frequently only reining up their horses when within a spear's length of the Christians, while those in the rear discharged over the heads of both parties thick volleys of arrows. One of these struck the litter in which the Queen was seated, who loudly screamed, and the red spot was on Richard's brow in an instant. "Ha, Saint George!" he exclaimed, "we must take some order with this infidel scum." But Edith, whose litter was nearer, thrust her head out, and with her hand holding one of the shafts, exclaimed, "Royal Richard, beware what you do. See, these arrows are headless." "Noble, sensible wench!" exclaimed Richard. "By heaven, thou shamest all by thy readiness of thought and eye. Be not moved, my English hearts," he exclaimed to his followers. "Their arrows have no heads, and their spears, too, lack the steel points. It is but a wild welcome after their savage fashion, though doubtless they would rejoice to see us daunted or disturbed. Move onward, slow and steady." The little phalanx moved forward accordingly, accompanied on all sides by the Arabs, with the shrillest and most piercing cries. The bowmen, meanwhile, displaying their agility by shooting as near the crests of the Christians as was possible, without actually hitting them, while the lancers charged each other with such rude blows of their blunt weapons that more than one of them lost his saddle, and well nigh his life in this rough sport. All this, though designed to express welcome, had rather a doubtful appearance in the eyes of the Europeans. As they had advanced nearly half way towards the camp, King Richard and his suite forming, as it were, the nucleus round which this tumultuous body of horsemen howled, whooped, skirmished, and galloped, creating a scene of indescribable confusion, another shrill cry was heard, on which all these irregulars, who were on the front and upon the flanks of the little body of Europeans, wheeled off, and forming themselves into a long and deep column, followed with comparative order and silence in the rear of Richard's troops. The dust began now to dissipate in their front, when there advanced to meet them, through that cloudy veil, a body of cavalry of a different and more regular description, completely armed with offensive and defensive weapons, and who might well have served as a bodyguard to the proudest of Eastern monarchs. This splendid troop consisted of 500 men, and each horse which it contained was worth an earl's ransom. The riders were Georgian and Circassian slaves in the very prime of life. Their helmets and hauberks were formed of steel rings, so bright that they shone like silver. Their vestages were of the gayest colours, and some of cloth of gold or silver. Their sashes were twisted with silk and gold, their rich turbans were plumed and jewelled, and their sabres and poniards, of Damascene steel, were adorned with gold and gems on hilt and scabbard. This splendid array advanced to the sound of military music, and when they met the Christian body, they opened their files to the right and left, and let them enter between their ranks. Richard now assumed the foremost place in his troop, aware that Saladin himself was approaching. Nor was it long when, in the centre of his bodyguard, surrounded by his domestic officers and those hideous negroes who guard the Eastern harem, and whose misshapen forms were rendered yet more frightful by the richness of their attire, came the Soldan, with the look and manners of one on whose brow nature had written, "This is a king." In his snow white turban, vest, and wide Eastern trousers, wearing a sash of scarlet silk without any other ornament, Saladin might have seemed the plainest dressed man in his own guard. But closer inspection discerned in his turban that inestimable gem which was called by the poets the Sea of Light. The diamond on which his signet was engraved, and which he wore in a ring, was probably worth all the jewels of the English crown, and a sapphire which terminated the hilt of his cangiar was not of a much inferior value. It should be added that, to protect himself from the dust, which in the vicinity of the Dead Sea resembles the finest ashes, or perhaps out of Oriental pride, the Soldan wore a sort of veil attached to his turban, which partly obscured the view of his noble features. He rode a milk white Arabian, which bore him as if conscious and proud of his noble burden. There was no need of further introduction. The two heroic monarchs, for such they both were, threw themselves at once from horseback, and the troops halting and the music suddenly ceasing, they advanced to meet each other in profound silence, and, after a courteous inclination on either side, they embraced as brethren and equals. The pomp and display upon both sides attracted no further notice. No one saw aught save Richard and Saladin, and they two beheld nothing but each other. The looks with which Richard surveyed Saladin were, however, more intently curious than those which the Soldan fixed upon him, and the Soldan also was the first to break silence. "The Melech Ric is welcome to Saladin, as water to the desert. I trust he hath no distrust of this numerous array. Excepting the armed slaves of my household, those who surround you with eyes of wonder and welcome are, even with the humblest of them, the privileged nobles of my 1,000 tribes. For who that could claim a title to be present would remain at home when such a prince was to be seen as Richard, with the terrors of whose name, even on the sands of Yemen, the nurse stills her child, and the free Arab subdues his restive steed?" "And these are all nobles of Araby?" said Richard, looking around on wild forms with their persons covered with hikes, their countenances swart with the sunbeams, their teeth as white as ivory, their black eyes